Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another lecture sponsored by the Lithuanian World Center Lithuanian Heritage Club. Today's topic is Recreating Lithuania, the Journey of Displaced Persons, presented by Dr. Robertas Vitas. We thank the Lithuanian Research Center for partnering with us to present this lecture. It is a great privilege to have Dr. Vitas with us. He is known throughout the Lithuanian community not only for his deep knowledge of Lithuanian history, but also for his generosity in sharing that knowledge through lectures like this one. A summa cum laude graduate of Loyola University Chicago, Dr. Vitas earned his master's and PhD in political science, specializing in national security, international law, and political philosophy. He served as a visiting scholar at Northwestern University and in the U.S. Army Reserve, including as a liaison to Lithuanian troops during early NATO Partnership for Peace exercises. Dr. Vitas is the current chairman of the board of the Lithuanian Research Center, the largest Lithuanian academic institution, archive, and publisher outside of Lithuania. He has published extensively on U.S.-Lithuanian relations, civil military affairs, and national security, and has served on the editorial boards of Armed Forces and Society, Journal of Baltic Studies, Lituanus, and Presidential Studies Quarterly. Beyond his scholarly work, he has served as executive director of the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces and Society. He served as the vice president of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies and currently serves as chairman of the board of the Vidunas Youth Fund. Please join me in welcoming our presenter, Dr. Robertas Vitas.
Thank you, Sharunai, and hello, everybody. I'll say hello and good evening. I think we have almost every time zone represented here this evening from coast to coast. And it was an honor for me to be invited to join you. Um, and I'm really looking forward to the presentation and to any questions and discussion that we might have. I'm going to share my screen now and take us through the slides. I hope everybody can see. So yes, recreating Lithuania, the journeys of displaced persons. And this recreation of Lithuania has taken place any number of times in the Lithuanian community, or I should say Lithuanian communities, plural, as they have sought to maintain their Lithuanian national consciousness outside of Lithuania. Whether they left of their own volition, seeking a better life, or whether they were forced from their country to distant shores and distant countries. But Lithuanians have always sought to recreate what I'll call a safe space in their national journey. So I'll start off with just a little bit of history, a little bit of context on World War II and why these persons became displaced persons. So Lithuania, in between World War I and World War II, was surrounded by a maelstrom of events, um, enemies, sometimes danger from without, and also from agitation within. And some of you might know that from 1920 until 1938, the capital of Vilnius and the Vilnius region was actually occupied by Poland. During the Wars of Independence, one of Lithuania's opponents was Poland, and Lithuania lost fully one-third of its territory. It always claimed that territory, but during that time period, during that 18 years, the second largest city in Lithuania, Kaunas, served as the provisional capital. An incident took place along the demarcation line between Lithuanian and Polish forces in March of 1938, where a Polish soldier made an incursion into Lithuanian territory. According to Lithuanian forces, he pointed his weapon at Lithuanian soldiers, whereupon they opened fire and he was killed. His body was returned to the Poles. There was a protocol established between the two countries, despite their state of war. But then several days later, the Polish government issued an ultimatum. demanding that Lithuania restore diplomatic relations with Warsaw. Um, During that time frame, Polish soldiers began massing along the demarcation line. The Polish Navy increased its presence in the Baltic Sea, and um, Lithuania decided to accept the ultimatum. They felt they did not have the military wherewithal to be able to challenge the Poles. Um, Almost exactly a year later, Germany presented an ultimatum to Lithuania. So the port of Lithuania, Klaipėda, and the Klaipėda region, also known as Mažoji Lietuva or Lithuania Minor, the Klaipėda region was under the control of the Lithuanian government. However, Germany considered Klaipėda to be Memel, and they considered it to be occupied territory. And indeed, Germany during that time period would issue maps in English referring to occupied Memel. And they distributed those maps in England and the United States to try to bolster their case to receive to bolster their case for the Klaipėda region. Well, Germany presented an ultimatum. They demanded the Klaipėda region, and the same German forces began massing along the border and in the Baltic Sea. Once again, Lithuania accepted the ultimatum, and this time actually ceded territory,
Yeah, you
ceded
can
the
sit here.
Klaipėda region
Yeah,
to Germany.
put that on my chair or take it out.
Oops, I think we've got someone joining in. Then what I have bolded here is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 23rd, 1939. Let me scroll to the next slide here. Here we have our friends, in quotes, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin and the German foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. And what the Germans and the Soviets did was sign a mutual non-aggression pact stating that neither would attack the other. But there were also secret protocols that were attached to the non-aggression pact, which divided Eastern Europe between the two countries into two different spheres of influence.
I don't know if I'm on.
Originally, Lithuania was actually supposed to go to Germany, but then in a later protocol, about a month after August 23rd, Germany then ceded Lithuania to the Soviet sphere of influence. So following that, Poland was attacked in September of 1939, attacked by Germany from the west on September 1st and by the USSR from the east on September 17th. So Poland was now completely occupied by both Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, as the Soviet Union was attacking Poland, they also attacked Polish forces in the Vilnius region. So after the cessation of hostilities on Polish soil, the Soviets decided to offer a gift, in quotes, to Lithuania, that they would give the Vilnius territory back to Lithuania. But there were strings attached that in return for their historic capital and for the region surrounding Vilnius,
my face was
the Red Army would be allowed
my face
to
never
establish
showed up.
4 military bases on Lithuanian soil. And you see there in Naujoji Vilnia, which is just east of Vilnius, and then in Prienai and Alytus, which are south of Kaunas, and in Gaižiūnai, which is northeast of Kaunas. And so practically the two largest cities of Kaunas and Vilnius were surrounded by Soviet troops, by Red Army troops already in the country. So now finally we have another ultimatum. Oh, let me actually, before we get to the Soviet ultimatum of June 1940, just a shot here. These are Lithuanian forces now entering Vilnius. The Cathedral of Vilnius is there in the background. They're starting their march on what is once again called Gediminas Avenue or Gedimino Prospektas. So now they have retaken control of our historic capital, but in return for a large price. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we have Kaunas here, which had been the provisional capital, the second largest city. So over here by Jonava, next to Jonava is Gaižiūnai. This was one Red Army base. Then south here we have Prienai and Alytus. These were two other Red Army bases. And then just east of the capital of Vilnius is an area called Naujoji Vilnia, and that was the fourth Red Army base. So the third ultimatum that Lithuania had to deal with in 3 years took place on June 14th, 1940, when the Soviet Union demanded that an unlimited number of Red Army troops be allowed onto Lithuanian territory. They accused Lithuania of having kidnapped Red Army soldiers. Actually, what had happened was many Red Army soldiers deserted because the conditions were so horrible. They didn't have proper shelter, they didn't have proper food or clothing. And in fact, I remember my grandmother saying how she felt so sorry for these Russian soldiers that she and some of the other women would take food to them because they were not being fed sufficiently by their own officers. So this was a trumped up ultimatum, and during that time, 221,000 Red Army soldiers had massed at the Lithuanian border. Now, this is over and above the several thousand soldiers that were already on Lithuanian soil. The Lithuanian government once again felt they did not have the wherewithal to resist the Soviets, and they felt that if they were to truly resist the Red Army, that it would bring such a holocaust upon the country that they said, no, we just have to let this happen. So here you see a border post. You see over there on the left the Vytis, our national symbol on the post. That was, indicating the beginning of Lithuanian territory. And these are now Red Army soldiers which are invading the country very peacefully, marching in. So let's begin. Oh, I'm sorry, Sharuna, your hand is up.
Got you. Roberta, sorry for the interruption. Are you able to add me as a co-host now, by any chance?
Let's see. It says make host. Would that make both of us hosts then if I were to do that?
Let's try it.
Okay,
Let's see if you're still able to share your screen.
Okay. And so now it's asking me to change host to you.
Okay.
So I'm going to do that. Oh, I just advanced. Can you see that?
Okay.
Okay, that's great. So you're the host, but I can advance my slides.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. So that began 3 successive occupations of the country. What we call the first Soviet occupation from June 1940 until June 1941, then a 3-year-long German occupation from June of 41 until July 4th, 1944, and then the very long second Soviet occupation, which took place from July of 1944 until the declaration of renewed independence on March 11th, 1990. And I write de jure there, so Lithuania announced that it was reestablishing its ability to exercise its sovereignty. But I say that the occupation continued de facto until August 31, 1993, because that was the day that the final Russian soldiers and Russian forces left the country. And it was effective on that date that Lithuania had complete control over its territory. So with the first occupation, of course, was a terrible series of events for Lithuania. In that 1 year from June 15, 1940 until June 14, 1941, 6,606 people were arrested. 3,565 of them were deported to Siberia or other points within the USSR. But that was bad enough, but it was only the beginning, because then we saw the mass deportations of June 1941, which began in the middle of the night on Saturday, June 14th of that year. And so literally you had the NKVD, the Soviet security forces, according to prearranged lists, invading homes, knocking on doors in the middle of the night, or kicking in doors, checking the occupants according to prearranged lists, searching for weapons, gold, and currency. Some were allowed a few moments to hurriedly pack some belongings, and others were not. During the time, those 4 days, June 14 to June 18, 17,500 people were deported. 41% of them were children under the age of 16, and 17.6% of those who were deported died in captivity, either on their way to Siberia or other points west, or when they got there. Others were executed in Lithuania, some very brutally, and I won't share any photographs or any information relative to that, but many people suffered. Now, there were prearranged lists for who was going to be deported. How were those determined? Well, typically, these were people who were considered part of the elite and their families. Who were the elite? Police officers, military officers, teachers, principals of schools, journalists, professors, anybody who was considered part of the political, the military, economic, or intellectual elite could have found themselves on those lists. And of course, their families were deported as well. This is, somebody's illustration, a drawing of how people were pulled from their homes. This is when they were driven to railroad stations. Family members were separated from each other, and then they waited for the trains to take them to points unknown. These were typically freight cars or cattle cars, people sealed in with no windows, with minimal ventilation. Here are some poor souls looking through a barbed window of a train wagon. I mentioned about 41% were children. Here are a couple of children on one of the trains. Very sad pictures here, but it's unfortunately, it's unfortunately a part of our history, is a part of our history that has to be remembered. So those deportations took place in June of 1941, right at the same time, and this was not pre-planned. Operation Barbarossa began, which was the German assault on the Soviet Union. Despite the fact that there was that non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed 2 years before, of course, both Hitler and Stalin knew that that was just a way of buying some time. So a long 3-year German occupation ensued, and then as Germany was losing the war, it was being squeezed, of course, from the West by the Americans, the British, and by the Free French forces, and from the East by Soviet forces. So now Soviet forces were pushing German forces westward, and they were getting close to Lithuania. Many Lithuanians remembered the terrible first Soviet occupation of 1940 and 1941, and those who knew that they were on lists, but they had somehow avoided arrest and deportation in 1941, knew that this time they would not be as fortunate. So they began a long trek west that sometimes took 9 months. And the objective was to get as far west as possible. They knew Germany was losing the war, and their objective was to get as far west as possible, no matter how, until they saw an American or a British soldier. And then they would know that they were somewhat safe now in pulling. But this was a 9-month long journey, and there were very harrowing stories that these displaced persons have shared. They were bombed and strafed by all air forces as their wagons were moving along roads as their trains were moving west or they were on foot. Pilots would see columns of people, and they didn't care that they were civilians and that there were children there in those columns. They were bombed. They were strafed by Americans, by British, by Germans, by Soviet forces. They were forced to leave their train. They were forced to leave their wagons and jump into ditches or somewhere alongside of the column of wagons and trains as as the columns and trains were strafed. They saw bombardment, many ruins. I remember my mother, who was a young girl at the time, recalling body parts blown into trees. So, you imagine, how that affects a person, and this was a big part of their childhood. But still, they persevered. They didn't know what the next hour would bring. They didn't know what the next day would bring. They had to sleep outside no matter what the conditions. Women gave birth to babies in the snow. And truly, I cannot even wrap my head around what these people experienced. But then eventually, they did make it. Most of them made it to the western part of Germany, which by then was occupied Germany, and Western Germany was occupied by the American, British, and French forces. So at the end of the Second World War, at least 11 million people in general had been displaced from their home countries, and about 7 million of them ended up in Western occupied Germany. The Allies categorized these refugees as displaced persons and assigned the responsibility for their care to an agency that became known as UNRWA, or the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. There were over 60,000 Lithuanian displaced persons in Germany, Austria, Denmark, and Italy. This is a map of Germany. Not all of over here, it says Rusu Zona. This was the Soviet zone of occupation. They certainly didn't want to be there. Up north, we had the British zone. Then in the middle here, we had the American zone. And then down toward the bottom, the Free French had kind of a token zone of occupation. These were just the major camps, places like Augsburg, Nordlingen, Tübingen, Hanau. I know Hanau because my father was there. Up here in the British zone, you had Detmold and Blomberg. Those were very well-known camps. But then there were also many other installations. These were very often old German army barracks, sometimes other industrial or school buildings. Sometimes they were private homes. Sometimes the Americans and the British would drive the vanquished German civilians out of their homes, and that's where they would place these Lithuanian displaced persons, and of course displaced persons from many other countries: Latvians, Estonians, Poles, Ukrainians, Hungarians, and others from East Central Europe. Just an example of this is a larger displaced persons camp with a number of larger dormitories and then smaller buildings then off to the side. Sometimes also the overflow was housed in other private housing or even castles that were close by to the formal camps. This is kind of a view from outside. Also, these are more wooden barracks. The other ones were stone and brick barracks. These are wooden barracks here. This young man who's sitting on the hill then became the famous filmmaker Jonas Mekas, who lived in New York City as a displaced person. This is just one example of quarters. This is, one person with a little bed. You can see the laundry hanging there. Also, many different ways of housing displaced persons. If they were in a home, each family might be given a different bedroom. One family's in the living room, one family's in the dining room. Sometimes, if it was a larger hall, then a family would receive maybe 200 square feet or so. And then they would have blankets hanging on ropes, which would try to give these families some sense of privacy. So 200 square feet sounds like a lot, but actually that's about 20 feet by 10 feet. To have 3 people or 4 people or 5 people living in 20 feet by 10 feet, they're sharing beds, or they might be sleeping on a mat on the floor. Maybe there's a little desk, maybe a chair, pretty cramped quarters. Um, Despite the fact that they had gone through a Soviet occupation, a Nazi occupation, and 9 months of an arduous and very dangerous journey, the Lithuanians have a great sense of perseverance and stick-to-itiveness. And so they immediately began, I would say, not administering the camps on their own, but establishing their own committees, their own schools to make sure that these camps were kept clean, to make sure that the camps were decorated, to make sure that Lithuanian national life could be recreated. And this was, another place where for several years Lithuanians recreated their homeland. So you can see they've got some trees and bushes planted. They have a couple of flagpoles there in the main court. There are people who are standing there over there on the left and over there on the right. And there were Lithuanian committees that were assigned to kind of police up the Lithuanians. And in fact, I saw one memo from a camp that went out, would be put up on a bulletin board and was typed on with, carbon paper, that said that the committee had noticed that some Lithuanians had gone into town. They weren't properly dressed. They had been drinking too much in town, and to remind them that they represent Lithuania and that they should always comport themselves properly and with dignity. So, kudos to them for doing so. Here we also see, they tried to decorate the camps. There's some gates there in the back. This appears to be a visiting bishop who's coming to the camp. You have children in Lithuanian national costume. You have other children here on the left and over on the right holding flowers. And it was amazing what they were able to do. Just today I saw a picture, a lady where I'm in Los Angeles, even though I'm based in Lamont and in Chicago. I'm in Los Angeles right now, and for a week we've been conducting interviews with DPs, and these people are 80 years old, 85, 90 years old. And one lady showed her first communion photograph, and there were several Lithuanian children there, and she said, "Look, you know what? Despite the conditions, everybody's dressed nicely. Either the British or the American authorities were very generous in giving us clothing, giving us papers, pencils, chalk for our schools, and so they wanted to appear in a dignified fashion. This is a school. They established their own school. School teachers from Lithuania came together, and they would get a blackboard. They'd get some chalk. Sometimes you had several classes that were combined into one room. Also, different ways of preparing food. Sometimes there were communal kitchens. Sometimes food was distributed, and they were prepared in smaller kitchens. Here, children are waiting either for milk or soup. That looks like a British soldier who's ladling out their food. Organizations reestablished themselves. The Catholic Ateitininkai, the Scouts, various theater groups, choirs, dance groups. Here you have a dance festival taking place. Also, they tried to celebrate Lithuanian holidays, whether it was Vasario 16, Independence Day, Kūčios, which is Christmas Eve. They, again, wanted to recreate Lithuania there under those circumstances. And of course, having a group of Lithuanians together, how can you have them without playing some basketball? So sports teams were also established, a volleyball and a basketball being the two favorite ones. This is a group of Lithuanian Girl Scouts who are giving an oath. They're in their uniforms. They're giving the scout oath with their three fingers, and they're moving on to the next rank. And you see the vitis there created. I think that's out of moss and rocks that they've created that vitis around a flagpole. Also, to just show how, I'll just say, tough and resilient the Lithuanians were, you had all kinds of ages represented in the displaced persons camps, from babies all the way to, people who were 85, 90 years old who had managed to escape. You had college age students there. You also had professors. So the Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians got together and they established the Baltic University in Pinneberg, Germany. In Lithuanian, it's Baltijos Universitetas. And so for about 3 years, the Baltic University functioned, teaching various topics. Again, this is post-war Germany, rubble all around. Still unexploded munitions around. It's an occupied country, and yet the Lithuanians were able to do that. Now, in 1948, the United States Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act of 1948. There were several delegations from the U.S. government that visited the displaced persons camps and then made reports to the State Department and also to President Truman on the condition of the displaced persons. And while the displaced persons attempted to recreate Lithuania, there were still difficult conditions there. And so Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act, which now allowed a certain number of immigrants, Lithuanians and from other nationalities, to enter the United States. And from 1949 to 1952, about half of the 900,000 immigrants that entered the United States were displaced persons, almost 500,000 displaced persons. So skriningas, that was the way of Lithuanianizing the word screening. So the United States opened its doors very generously, but at the same time, they wanted to they wanted to keep an eye on who was being admitted, and they would especially look at people's health. They wanted to admit healthy people to come to the United States to work, to study, and to live. So they had to go through screening, and they were assisted by various organizations, the International Refugee Organization, the Red Cross, the Lithuanian organization BALFAS, or the United Lithuanian Relief Fund of America. Churches, Catholic and Lutheran, the Lutheran churches also established committees to help Lithuanians find sponsors in the United States. You couldn't come to the United States without a sponsor who guaranteed that you would have a place to live and that you would be studying and or working once you entered the United States. So this is an illustration somebody drew in Germany, a DP's way to the USA. And so if you starting from the left there, you see a thread going through the eyes of various needles, like a camel going through the eye of a needle, to show, this was also a long, arduous process. You had to go through the International Refugee Organization Medical Commission, then you had to go through the American physician, then you had to go through the DP Commission, then you were interviewed by somebody from the U.S. Consul's office, then there was a final inspection, and then finally you had a good chance of emigrating to the United States. So by the fall of 1948, the refugees who qualified under the Displaced Persons Act began boarding U.S. Army transport ships that had brought soldiers to Europe. And the first 813 displaced persons left the German port of Bremenhaven on October 21st, 1948. And so there's a quote, "The trip to New York was free, the food on board was ample, and the American Red Cross gave each immigrant welcome to the U.S. gift of $6. I've also heard different figures. I've heard $5, I've heard $10. This person got $6, so somewhere in the middle. You see people boarding the ships here. You see the sign International Refugee Organization. There they are already on the decks down here below. You see a couple of American officers. Here's an example of a ship, the USAT, U.S. Army Transport General S.D. Sturgis, which made 21 displaced persons voyages from Germany to the United States. This ship is special to me because this is the ship that brought my father to the United States in 1950. America welcomes its new citizens. There we go. That's a very nice sign. But uh, just like other ethnic groups throughout U.S. history, the displaced persons weren't necessarily always welcome. So about 30,000 Lithuanian displaced persons came to the U.S. One-third of them settled in Chicago. They also met with discrimination in schools and in the workplace. They'd be set apart. Their accents were ridiculed. Their initial lack of knowledge of the English language was pointed out, and so they had a difficult time ethnically. So they face the ethnic discrimination. Most Lithuanians are Catholic. Fortunately, by then, the anti-Catholic discrimination, which sadly had also been a part of U.S. history, had decreased by the time of their arrival. Now, also, others were welcomed. Other DPs were welcomed to the United States in a different way. Those who came in 1950 and 1951, they came at a time when the United States was fighting the Korean War. So Lithuanian DP males were often almost literally taken off of the boat in New York Harbor, drafted into the U.S. Army without knowing English, and they were shipped off to Asia and they were shipped off to Korea to fight for a country that they barely knew. So that was a very, very interesting time period for the DPs. Now, in terms of the economic impact of Lithuanian displaced persons, so 416,800 Americans were killed in World War II. The U.S. did not want to return to the conditions of the Great Depression prior to the war. So they wanted to build an economic engine. And, frankly, the U.S. very generously admitted the DPs to our country. But at the same time, they wanted people working and contributing to the economy. So the median income of workers in 1953 was estimated at $3,200. Okay, this is a long, long time ago. What I did, just some very basic arithmetic. In that next bullet point, I've got 3,200 times 10,000 equals 32 million. So that $3,200 figure is that median income of workers in 1953. The 10,000 figure is 1/3 of the 30,000 displaced persons that came to the United States. So these were different times. These were the old days. So my assumption was that typically the father of the family is the one who's going off to work. Mom might be working full-time, part-time, but also watching children at home as well. So just to play it safe and to be conservative, I said, okay, we've got 10,000 DPs working, and in 1953, their total aggregate income is $32 million. Now, in today's money, that's about $388 million. So, you talk about an economic impact. 388 million is certainly real money, and it's a great deal of money. However, when you consider the scope of the United States, $388 million really then isn't that much. Many years ago, I worked for a very large Fortune 100 company, and just half of our subsidiary did $1 billion of business every year. But what's significant about the 32 million in those days, or the 388 million now, the economic impact was not nationwide, but in concentrated pockets with greater local impact. So certainly one of the pockets was Chicago's Marquette Park. And you see Marquette Park, you see the Daughters Girenas monument there. You see the church building, the Nativity BVM church building that was built by the DPs. There in the background, you see the school building. And back before 1957, before this new church was built, both the school, the assembly hall, and the church were in that old brown brick building back there. And so Marquette Park was approximately mile and a half, a mile and a half square. Many of us, maybe a number of us on this Zoom, grew up in Marquette Park. I was at one point right there on the Lithuanian Plaza. And then later on, I thought as a little kid, we moved really far west. We only moved to about 63rd and Kedzie over here. But for me, it was my DP journey. So this is 69th Street, how it looked, Lithuanian Plaza Court, because it was renamed. There's an event here, most likely for Vasario 16, a view of 69th Street. In 1957, the Lithuanian Youth Center was built about 55th and Western. And then the Draugas newspaper, which had been operating since 1909 in various locations, the very same year in 1957, built their building. The Marians built a monastery and also a printing press on 63rd Street near Midway Airport. And of course, then later on, the displaced persons were able to purchase this building in Lamont that became the Lithuanian World Center, the largest Lithuanian center anywhere outside of Lithuania. So the economic impact continues. And what economic impact do we have here? So for instance, with the construction of these buildings, okay, the church, and then heading back to, let's say, these two buildings, you've got the Lithuanians who are collecting money. They need to hire architects. They need to hire a construction company. They need to purchase building materials. And then around these areas, you had communities develop, not just restaurants and bars and bakeries, but things like shoe repair, things like jewelry and watch repair. So you had this little economic engine that now existed in Marquette Park that didn't exist prior to the arrival of the displaced persons. Another example of a closely knit island is Detroit, which was a much smaller community near the Detroit River and the Ambassador Bridge. Over here where my cursor is in the lower right, it's the old Shvento Antano St. Anthony parish. My parents happened to get married in this church, and then across the street were a number of Lithuanian stores and businesses and a Lithuanian hall. So what I just showed you was kind of down here in the lower middle of the screen, a little bit southwest of downtown Detroit, near Clark Park, near Werner Highway and West Grand Boulevard, as I mentioned, right near the Detroit River. And here's the Ambassador Bridge. But it's also the same thing, kind of a closely knit island. Also, the Lithuanians had an opportunity at the expansion of higher education that took place after World War II with the GI Bill and with other legislation. And so, Lithuanian DPs were able to go to college. They were able to achieve the same educational status as their parents, or perhaps even go beyond their parents, because remember, many of the displaced persons were the intelligentsia. They were the professors, the teachers, the journalists, the military officers. So these were people who were typically, well educated, and they were professionals. So their children had that opportunity in the United States, and certainly with their educations and with the opportunity for a higher income. Well, that's also an economic contribution, an economic impact of the displaced persons. Now, also at the bottom there, in the 1960s, Lithuanian males in the United States had another reason to attend university. Some of you who are old enough would know that the Vietnam War was going on at the time, and if you were able to get into college, you received a deferment from service. So, well, that was also an incentive. The Lithuanians never, the DPs never forgot their country. So various organizations were established, the Lithuanian American Community, Lithuanian American Council, and they dealt with various political incidents or scenarios. For instance, the very first one there, I won't go through all of them. The Kirsten Committee, Senator Charles Kirsten, or I'm sorry, Representative Charles Kirsten was a congressman from Wisconsin, and he held hearings in a number of cities. He was in Chicago, Detroit, and Washington, D.C., interviewing displaced persons about the atrocities that they had seen under the Soviets, what brought them to the United States. And it was a way for Representative Kirsten and his committee to educate his colleagues there on Capitol Hill and to educate others in the United States government and the American news media about what was going on, not just in Lithuania, but also in other countries as well. In general, the DPs were, even though they were not there in Lithuania under Soviet occupation, but in the halls of politics, in the halls of government, and in media, the Lithuanians DPs were constantly fighting for independence for their country. And indeed, the DPs considered themselves not immigrants, but exiles. They were exiled from their country. They were forced to flee their homeland, and the spirit of returning to their country, that hope was a part of the DP existence. And there, that bottom bullet point is a song that I was taught when I was a child. Pučia vėjas neša laivą, nuneš mane į Lietuvą. Tai bus linksma Lietuvoj. In other words, the wind is blowing, it's carrying the ship, and that ship is going to take me to Lithuania, where everybody will be happy. Now, certainly by the time 1990 rolled around and Lithuania regained her independence, these displaced persons had been in the United States for 40 years. They had studied here, they had worked here, they were retired here, they had children and grandchildren. So the notion of returning back to Lithuania in 1990 for just about all of them was not realistic. But let's say that Lithuania would have achieved her independence in 1955, 1960, perhaps the picture would have been different. And so, once again in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Omaha, the different cities, Hartford, West Waterbury, Connecticut, many others. Lithuanians again reestablished pre-war Lithuania with their various organizations, even their political parties, and ethnic socialization took place through various schools, choirs, dance groups, theater groups, scouts, and other organizations. Over there on the lower right, there's a car wash taking place in the parking lot of Nativity BVM School and Church there on 69th and Washtenaw. And from the looks of that car, that looks like about 1975 or so. So the DPs were living in two worlds, and it's really reflective of what was written, declared in what was called the Lithuanian Charter of 1949, or Lietuvių Charta, which was kind of a statement of principles of exiled Lithuanians. So on the one hand, the Lithuanian Charter stated that the state is the supreme organization of a national community. State independence is a condition for the development and survival of national culture. Through science, wealth, and sacrifice, the Lithuanian fights to defend and maintain the independent state of Lithuania. On the other hand, at the same time, concurrently, a Lithuanian is loyal to the country he or she lives in. So the DPs and the children of DPs, like myself and like Elite, who spoke earlier, and the grandchild of DPs like Šarūnas, we've had kind of one foot in Lithuania and one foot in the United States. And an example of this, kind of my own personal hero, a friend of mine, is General Jonas Kronkaitis. He came to the United States as a young displaced person with his family. He served in the United States for about 26 years. Then later on, Lithuania called. He served as Deputy Defense Minister and then later on Chief of Defense. He's the one who helped usher Lithuania into NATO. He's a patriot of both the United States and Lithuania. And so that's it for recreating Lithuania and honoring these very resilient displaced persons. Thank you.
Ačiū labai, Robertai.
Prašau.
Do you have time for questions, if there are any?
Indeed, as long as you need.
Okay, feel free to unmute and jump in.
Maybe everybody fell asleep. You can probably hear the siren. They're coming to get me.
Thank you, Roberta. This is Tony Mankus.
Hi, Tony. Good to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you. As I may have said briefly, I was a 5-year-old child when we left Lithuania on a train car, and my father worked on a railroad. So we were able to board the trains with the retreating German soldiers, and we ended up in Kempten, Allgäu. So I appreciate the, sort of a quick overview of the experience that my family and I went through your larger lens. And I guess you've devoted your life to studying the Lithuanian history and other things. But in the last few years, I guess you've been focused on the displaced persons experience as Dievo Paukšteliai, as we know ourselves. So thank you for making the time and effort to do that. But just briefly, my oldest brother, John, my hero, my role model, I guess, he was, 7 years older than I. And when we came to the United States, we settled in Elizabeth, New Jersey, which had a first wave of Lithuanians living there. And they had a St. Peter and Paul Lithuanian parish and so on. You probably know quite a bit about that. But in any case, so he was first kidnapped by the Nazis on our way to Germany. And by the grace of God, he was sent to the Nazi Hitlerjugend school. But 12-year-old boy, he figured out how to escape. And by the grace of God, he got on the next train heading, he had no idea where, but he ended up in Kempten, Allgäu, where our family had settled, and we were living in the railroad cars. So to the extent that, and he became, he joined, he was drafted by the Army. I guess he was about 20 years old when the Korean War started, as you alluded. But he said, no, he loved flying. So he enlisted instead of 2 years being drafted into the Army, he enlisted into the Air Force. And he became a mechanic, airplane mechanic, but he wanted to fly. And he succeeded becoming a pilot and eventually an officer. And after 23 years, he retired as a lieutenant colonel, and he helped with the moonshot, NASA new moonshot, among other things. And then he was decommissioned, or he was let go after 23 years. So he said, well, what should I do? So he went to law school in California, became a lawyer. So in any case, he died, I'd say less than a year ago. So that's a little bit of a story that I appreciate sharing with you and with the others. And the 5-second commercial, I did write a couple of books, including my memoir. It's called Where Do I Belong? It's written in English, but time permitting, I'm also an attorney. My wife's an attorney also, but time permitting, I may translated into Lithuanian. So those of you who are competent in English, the book is available on Amazon.com. You can Google my name or look for it on Amazon. It's called Where Do I Belong? So that's my 5-second commercial, Robert. So thank you. I wanted to share that. I hope it has some meaning to many of the other people that are here listening to your wonderful presentation. So thank you for the opportunity, Robert.
Thank you, Tony. And you brought up an interesting point. About you get on a train at a certain point. If you would have missed that train 5 minutes before, then you're stuck someplace, or you reach a fork in the road. One way may take you to freedom, another way may take you back into the hands of the Soviets. I've also heard a couple of stories. Bombs begin falling in the town where they are. You're over here in one shelter, you're okay. The shelter across the street gets bombed and people get killed. So much of it was, fate, luck, whatever the case may be. Did I see your hand up? However, I just scrolled through the chat. Let me just briefly address a couple of things here. There are a couple of questions about Lithuania's Jews. So of course, sadly, during the 3-year Nazi occupation, the Germans carried out their horrific plans against the Jewish people, not just in Germany and Poland, but anywhere that they were, and they also did that in Lithuania. I remember my father recounting how he was able to hear the machine gun fire in the distance, and everybody knew what was going on. These poor Jewish people were being executed. Fortunately, a number of Jews were protected by the Lithuanians, housed by the Lithuanians, and then as the Soviets were retreating, as the Soviets were advancing and the Germans were retreating, there were Lithuanian Jews or Litvaks that also moved along with the German army. Now, remember, at this point, the German army is in disarray. You have desertion. They know they're going to be losing. You've got German soldiers taking off their uniforms, throwing away their weapons. They don't want to be identified as Wehrmacht soldiers. So at this point, yeah, ironically, the Lithuanian Jews are retreating along with Lithuanian Gentiles and the German army, and the Germans at this point really don't care. And so, yes, there were Lithuanian Litvaks who ended up in the displaced persons camps and also came on the ships to the United States. So that was one. There were a couple of questions on that. And then I really appreciate the complimentary comments in the chat. There's one question from Susan. When Germany occupied Lithuania, were the men forced into military service? Yes, some were. So the Lithuanians tried to create kind of their own autonomous, almost like a military police, a unit called a Vietinė rinktinė, to try to show the Germans that, look, we can kind of govern ourselves and police ourselves here. But then when the Germans began pressuring them to form an SS unit and to begin participating in the Holocaust, then the order went out basically to melt into the woods, and literally overnight, this unit disappeared all over Lithuania. The men fled. Some were forced into military service, into the German armed forces. However, most would have been forced into various other kinds of work. Whether it was office work, whether it was doing engineering work, which is creating tank traps, building trenches, building buildings, things of that nature. My uncle, my father's brother, was taken, and he was taken to somewhere near Berlin at a Luftwaffe airfield, and he was forced to be a mechanic for the German Air Force. So there were different ways, different forms of forced labor. I'm sorry. So Audra, I saw your hand up.
What are you doing? We're trying to get out of the picture.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me? No?
Yes.
You can.
Okay, good.
Mhm.
Well, no.
Sorry, I think we interrupted you. Hold on,
Sorry.
bud. Let him go first.
Oh, no problem. I believe Audra left.
Oh,
I think
okay.
I think she had to leave.
I had a question.
Okay,
Well, basically, the young man that we just saw, I think she's he's a son or grandson of the greatest Lithuanian food person and writer on the magazine um, for
Lithuanian heritage.
for Lithuanian heritage. So my wife,
Yes.
who's sitting here, who is a sixth or seventh generation American, meaning she arrived here in the fifth 19. When did your parents get here, Susie?
1630.
1630, and here I was right off the same story that you have, um, arriving in a military transport and winding up in Chicago. So I grew up in Chicago, not in Market Park, but we were much closer to the stockyards and that area which was the old Lithuanian place, and then Lithuanian people have moved to Market Park, and now look at that. The activity and the sponsors of this program are in the western suburbs where the current pope is from. He happens not to be Lithuanian, and so we're a little bit disappointed. But so here we are. I appreciate the efforts of everybody. I know Elite by her name and conversation, but her grandfather grew up with me in Lithuania, and I knew him very well. So Elite is there. She is. She's finally showing. Hi there. And so Elite has kept me on the ball to get onto this program. I have many stories to tell about personal stories, but I won't go much into it. Um, uh, but I can tell you that the experience of being in the post-war camps in Germany was just absolutely fantastic. It was better than being in Lithuania. I mean, in Lithuania, in my first and second grade, I was a single child of two people. I wound up in those camps and I had 200 friends, and I learned French and German and English, and that at that age was very nice. Fortunately, they wouldn't take me into the Hitlerjugend because I was a foreigner, and the Russians didn't quite get us when they got um, um, to the Bavarian line. Basically, because my mother could speak Russian, and she convinced them that they're wonderful, and then we ran away and wound up in Bavaria, and have a very similar story that Mr. Viltus has.
Mhm.
So I hope this
So
is a
thank you.
very successful beginning to get a lot of English-speaking Lithuanians together. Tokiu būdu mes visi galime augti ir vienas kitą geriau žinoti.
Type. And also, I agree with you. Elite keeps me on the ball as well. And also, something that you should know if you don't, Elite's family has a distinguished military tradition, great service to our country, Lithuania. So just a great, tremendous lineage there. I saw in the chat there was oh gosh, and of course now. Oh, yes, actually a comment about Soviet agents. So yeah, there were initially Soviet agents were allowed to visit the displaced persons camps, and they would urge Lithuanians to return to their country, saying that it was wonderful and we have to rebuild Lithuania and all. Very, very sadly, uh, forced repatriations occurred I hate to say this, but the U.S. Army carried out a then secret operation. It was called Operation Keelhaul, which was rounding up Lithuanian displaced persons and handing them over to the Soviets to take back to Lithuania or to Siberia, or perhaps a worse fate. When this was clearly a violation of the U.S. policy of non-recognition of the Soviet occupation of Lithuania, which was declared in August of 1940. And when General Eisenhower discovered this, well, he immediately put a stop to this. Sadly, the group that suffered the highest number of repatriations were the Ukrainians. And there are some just absolutely heart-wrenching stories about how these Ukrainians would be surrounded, a Ukrainian camp would be surrounded, and instead of giving in to the Soviets or allowing themselves to be turned over to Soviet agents, they would commit suicide there in the camp. Death was better than a return to Soviet-occupied Lithuania. So some good stories. A lot of the children typically remember, those who were children at the time typically remember the good times, but there were also, even in the DP camps, some very difficult and dangerous times. General Raštikis, who had been the chief of Lithuania's armed forces from 1935 until from 1934 until 1939, they attempted to kidnap him from the displaced persons camp. So it was tough. I think they were safest when they were finally in the United States or other countries.
Could this be something that would be highlighted these days? Because again, Russia is very much in the headlines, shall we say? And this is the kind of country that it was. We experienced it. I was 9 years old when we fled. I remember what happened in Germany. I remember what happened in Klaipeda. I was born and grew up in Klaipeda. And so here we have a repetition of that history, and it's completely forgotten. And this Operation Keelhaul, I remember how my parents were petrified that could happen to them because it was happening everywhere. But it's completely forgotten. It's something that it's so unpleasant that it's shoved aside. So if you have any impact or possibility to highlight it again, to bring it up again, I for one would appreciate it.
So at the research center, that's what we tried to do over this past year, 2024 into 25, because it's the 80th anniversary of the migration of the DPs. And so actually, if you go to YouTube, to the Lithuanian Research Center channel, our presentations are there. We've also done a number of in-depth interviews with DPs. Fortunately, a book was written about Operation Keelhaul. So it was memorialized, but by now, yeah, it's a forgotten chapter in the DP history and also in the history of the United States. And yes, it's our intention to keep all of this alive.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Looks like, go ahead.
So not all of the people came to this country through Ellis Island. My family wound up landing in Massachusetts, but I don't know what port city they ended up with. But it wasn't a military ship. They said there was a guy with a wrench and a flashlight day and night checking the main boats to make sure the boat wouldn't start leaking. And when a whale came to the one side, everybody went to look at the whale, and the captain was screaming for people to go back because the boat was in danger of capsizing. But do you know what ports, when it wasn't Ellis Island or Pennsylvania, what ports it might have been in Massachusetts?
So, I mean, I don't know. I suspect Boston. I suspect Boston, but I'm not sure. Most people came through New York. Very few actually were processed through Ellis Island. Their paperwork had already been processed in Germany, so they bypassed Ellis Island. They went right into the port of New York, New York City, just a mile past the Statue of Liberty.
Right.
And then they were processed and then they went forth. So most came to New York. There were some who went to New Orleans, the port of New Orleans, and that's where they disembarked in the United States.
Well, my family always said it was Massachusetts, that it wasn't New York.
Mhm.
And then they took a train to Chicago and they ended up in Cicero. And you
Mhm.
know, there was the Catholic high school and a few other places there that I had quite a few Lithuanians, so they ended up in Cicero.
Sure.
But yeah, they talked that there were KGB Russian type people who would try to grab Lithuanians right off the street. You know, if they went outside the displaced person camp, try to grab them. And the Americans wouldn't do anything to stop them. But they weren't allowed to have guns, but there were German military police still. They had a police force, and if they saw the Russians trying to drag somebody into a car, they would go after him because they still had a great animosity for the Russians. So, you know, the American military wouldn't stop the Russians from grabbing Lithuanians off the street, but the Germans would, which is so ironic because it's true. The one night they heard the big trucks come in, and the next day there wasn't any Jews left in the whole village. Every Jewish house, the doors were open and there was nobody left inside.
So the German civilian police, the civil police, also had a hand in keeping an eye on the displaced persons once they were outside the DP camps.
Right.
Unfortunately, until the Cold War really took hold, the U.S. and the British still viewed the Soviets as their allies, and so not everybody got the word. When you start reaching company level, captain, lieutenant, sergeant, non-recognition policy, they haven't a clue what all of that is. And indeed, a completely different incident in 1970 when Simas Kudirka attempted to seek asylum in the United States. He was actually on a U.S. Coast Guard vessel, and the admiral in charge of the Boston District, Admiral William Ellis, gave the order to allow the Soviet forces onto the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Vigilant and take Kudirka back by force. It is the one and only time that the United States naval vessel, a United States naval officer, willingly allowed an enemy aboard the ship to carry out such a deed. Just as an aside, this guy Admiral Ellis, who gave the order, later on he was drummed out of the Coast Guard. But I found out later when he died, he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, which I consider a place of honor. And I really would like to see an effort made. He can be buried in another veteran cemetery, but to be buried in Arlington is a disgrace.
Is he related to the Kudirka that you know is in his Lithuanian history, the Great Kudirka, or not?
I don't know if anybody knows this. I am not sure if Simas Kudirka was related to Vincas Kudirka, who wrote what became the Lithuanian national anthem. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks.
Brenda, say something. You're on, Dad. No, okay. You're on. Dad,
That's it.
say something. Dad, say it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You gotta say something.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good hear you,
Okay.
Dad, you're on.
Yeah. Was I correct that your grandmother is a great cook and editor of the magazine, or
Oh,
not?
that's my mom and dad.
Or during your mom and dad?
Yep.
Oh, well, they're doing a beautiful job. And the focus has been on the Chicago area Lithuanians. I live in the woods of New Hampshire, My next door neighbor is a Lithuanian. There's all kinds of Lithuanians here who did not come necessarily here after World War II, but they got here around World War I. One of the best cemeteries around here, very beautifully maintained, is something called a National Lithuanian Cemetery. And it's in a town on the New Hampshire, Massachusetts border. And those people came over in the beginning of the last century. And the priests that came to serve them turned out to be not from Ireland, right? Irish priests. And the Lithuanians said, "No, we would like to have your language for sermons in Lithuanian." They said, "No, you have to do it in English."
Dad, I think you're about to say
And they wound up creating the Lithuanian national program, where the entire service, in the Lithuanian, in the church, instead of being in Latvian, was being done in Lithuanian to avoid being taken over by the English-speaking other Catholics. And they got into big trouble because they upset Rome very, very much. And they were called Lietuvių nacionalinė Katalikų bažnyčia. And it's a very beautiful memory of that original so-called first wave of Lithuanians. So, Šarūnai, you have a very Lithuanian name, and I do understand why they call you something else than Šarūnas. My Lithuanian name is Paulius, not Paul, not Paulus, Paulus. Why am I Paulus? Because my mother said, I want you to be as strong as the North Pole. She didn't want to call me Paul, so she called me Paulus. And my problem is that the government thinks I'm Paulus because I arrived here as a child Paulus, but everybody else calls me Paul. Well, I've never been Paul. So that's the end of my story. Welcome to, hope this happens again and we have a nice talk in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Got you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, if not, thank you everybody for coming, for listening. Thanks again to Dr. Robertas Vitas for being so generous with his time and knowledge. We will, this Zoom is being recorded, so we will publish it on the Lithuanian World Center YouTube channel in the next week or so, and we will email everyone a link to that recording. You can view it, you can share with others who you think could be interested, and we look forward to seeing you sometime soon.
On behalf of the Lithuanian World Center, thanks everybody. Ačiū. A special thanks to Robertas Vitas. Thanks to Šarūnas Daugirdas for all of his efforts in putting these programs together. We will continue to offer at least 2 online presentations a year, with a couple local ones to those who live in the Chicago area. Pauliau, sorry that maybe you could get your family to come to the Chicagoland area when we're doing some Easter egg dyeing or other cultural events. You're all welcome at the Lithuanian World Center. We really appreciate it. But Dr. Robertai Vitai, ačiū labai. This was really very interesting. Thank you.
Labai prašau. Thank you very much for the invitation. I really had a nice time with everybody. I enjoyed it.
Good night, everybody. Labanaktis.
Ačiū, iki.
Labanaktis.